o'clock now, and this morning the Public Accounts Committee are hearing from witnesses from the Department of Environment, and we'll be looking at environmental monitoring and compliance at the Environmental Monitoring and Compliance Division. I think we're looking at the water program. So I'd like to begin, as we usually do, with an introduction of our members. So if we could start with you, Vicki.
Vicki Conrad, MLA Queens.
Good morning, Matt Wynot, MLA Hammonds Plains, Upper Sackville.
Good morning, Clary McKinnon, MLA Pictou East.
Good morning, Howard Epstein, MLA for Halifax, Shubucto.
Morning, Keith Caldwell, MLA Preston.
Chris D'Entremont, MLA for Argyll.
Diana Whalen, MLA Halifax Clayton Park and Chair of the Committee.
Terry Spicer, Assistant Auditor General.
Darlene Henry, Committee Clerk.
And thank you very much. And as we're going to begin this morning, I'm going to turn it over to Miss Sarah Jane Snook, who will speak. And I would like to welcome you, Sarah Jane. I know this is your first time here at Public Accounts and that you are a new Deputy Minister with the government. And we welcome you, and I hope everything's going very well. We're looking forward to hearing from you today.
Thank you, Diana. I am delighted to be here today, and yes, I am relatively new in the job. I've been there a little over 3 months, but it's a delightful department to be part of, and I'm very proud to be here today to present the water strategy. Good morning. We're here to talk about Water for Life, Nova Scotia's water resource management strategy. Our province has more than 13,000 kilometers of coastline and an abundance of lakes, rivers, and wetlands. We are fortunate when it comes to water, but it isn't a resource we can take for granted. Like all Nova Scotians, we care about our water. We want to ensure it is safe, well protected, and properly used. Water is not an unlimited resource. It needs careful attention and management, which is the focus of our water strategy. Nova Scotia's strategy for managing drinking water has been in place since 2002. The drinking water strategy has resulted in upgrades to water treatment facilities, strengthened standards for water well construction, and even greater protection of municipal water supplies. A recent C.D. Howe Institute report by Stephen Ruddy, one of Canada's leading drinking water experts, credits Nova Scotia for its progress regarding safe drinking water and the quality of Nova Scotia Environment's drinking water program. Drinking water is just one of the ways water is essential to our daily lives. We need effective tools and strategies for managing all of our provincial water resources. The Environment Act designates Nova Scotia Environment as the lead government agency to manage and allocate Nova Scotia's water resources. Inspectors from our Environmental Monitoring and Compliance Division monitor, inspect, and enforce all approvals issued by Nova Scotia Environment related to water. The department issues approvals to anyone wishing to alter a water course, for example, by installing a culvert or bridge. We also issue approvals to facilities that provide public drinking water, such as municipal water supplies. And we administer approvals related to the protection of our water resources, such as those to industrial facilities and wastewater treatment plants. During the last fiscal year, inspectors from our Environmental Monitoring and Compliance Division completed 3,643 inspections related to the protection of water resources. This accounted for 42% of our inspections last year. In addition to the EMC division, Nova Scotia Environment has a dedicated water and wastewater branch with 19 staff and an annual operating budget of over $2 million. Government recognizes that water is essential to our health, our environment, and our economy. We are proud that with the launch of the Water for Life last December, Nova Scotia met its 2010 Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act commitment to develop a water resource management strategy. The water strategy also meets the commitment of the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment Strategic Directions for Water and supports the Council of the Federation Water Charter, which all premiers agreed to in 2010. The Water for Life strategy will guide how we manage all of our water resources in ways that will benefit all Nova Scotians. This strategy is the result of extensive consultation with individuals, community, and environmental groups, industry, the Mi'kmaq, municipalities, and other government departments. Water for Life is an integrated approach. This 10-year plan provides a framework for today and into the future. In total, the strategy contains 29 actions, and these actions fall under 3 categories. Those that help us better understand the quality and quantity of our water, those that help us to protect the quality and quantity of our water, and those that help us engage others in caring about our water. The 10-year water strategy also divides these actions by timeline. There are actions for today, which will be carried out within the 1 to 3 years, and the actions for tomorrow, which will be carried out within 3 to 10 years. We are pleased to say that after only 4 months since its launch, some of the strategy's initiatives are already underway or even complete. We've provided grants and resources to universities like Dalhousie and St. Mary's to develop water monitoring projects that will benefit all Nova Scotians. We launched the Water Portal, a comprehensive website that provides user-friendly online water information and resources. We're also working with the environmental groups like Clean Nova Scotia and the Ecology Action Centre, who are monitoring and educating Nova Scotians about groundwater. And this is just the beginning. Water for Life secures Nova Scotia's role as a leader in water resource management in Atlantic Canada and across the country. We are proud of Nova Scotia's water strategy, and we are pleased to be moving ahead with its implementation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Snook. And I would like to mention we've been joined by Mr. Scabar and Mr. McMaster. Welcome. And for the first 20 minutes, we will begin with the Liberal Caucus with Mr. Caldwell.
Thank you very much. Welcome, and it's nice to finally meet the new Deputy Minister. You are indeed in a very special department, and a department that doesn't get a lot of credit for the work you do, but I understand exactly what you do, and it's been a pleasure, my pleasure to work with your department and some of your staff over the last several years as a critic, which I'm no longer critic for environment, but it was really a pleasure working with him. We've got a great group of people working there. Just a few questions I have to start off here. In the new strategy, there doesn't seem to be really any firm or hard targets in the strategy for government to meet. Why didn't the government put goals and dates in place to ensure the strategy outlines were met?
The strategy is a framework to carry us forward for the next 10 years, and we have 29 action items in the strategy that will take place over that time. But we feel that that's the appropriate way to move the province forward.
Have you any intentions of enshrining any of the targets or any of the things that you put in place in legislation so that they're firm down the road? I realize it takes time to develop all these plans, but to really ensure that indeed our water resources are well protected.
Water resources are the priority of the department. They have been in our history and will be in the future going forward. And we try and manage them in a way that we think benefits all Nova Scotians. And perhaps in future some will be put in legislation, but currently we feel we have the right approach with the strategy going forward.
Other thing is, in Bridgewater, it was on the news today about potentially opening a new mine up, and I don't see anything wrong with opening mines, but because it does create jobs for people. But the town of Bridgewater is concerned about the watershed area. What involvement would the Department of Environment have with that, a review of that, and what's the process that we go through to ensure that the watershed will be protected?
Ms. Snook.
Mines do have an approval process within the government currently, and we would work in concert with other departments that have responsibility, like the Department of Natural Resources, to review any plans for mines in general, and specifically those that would affect any watershed development would be carefully scrutinized in the department. We have an environmental assessment process and also industrial approval process that both would likely be impacted.
Now, in that case where they're going to reopen a mine that was there, would it go through a typical complete environmental review for, in particular, the water in this case, or whatever else it may be? Because as far as I know, anytime there's a gold mine, there's arsenic, and arsenic gets in the water. And I'm going to ask you some questions on that in my own area where there's a problem with arsenic as a result of a gold mine from years and years ago. what process? Would the process be the same for reopening the mine, or would it be a new process that would have to start to go through the mine?
I'd like to give Dave Briggins a chance to speak as well. I don't know if my colleagues got properly introduced, but this is David Briggins, who heads up our water and wastewater branch, and he knows that situation specifically, so perhaps you'd like to add something that.
Yeah, Mr. Briggins.
Okay, yes, we do have a good process in place to deal with that specific issue and others that come up in municipal water supply areas, which is the case here. Each municipal water supply is required to have a source water protection plan, and there's a committee established that has representatives from the municipality, from different levels of government, different government departments, and they work together to address issues that come up within the watershed that relate to the drinking water supply. So in addition to the processes that the deputy talked about with approvals through different departments, we also have a very open, transparent process with others from the community are invited to attend those meetings, and issues are discussed and dealt with. And I know they have been dealing with this one. It's not a new issue. They've dealt with this in the past and will continue to do so moving ahead.
Specifically, my question was, would you go through the same process now, since it was a mine before, the environmental process? Exactly what process will this go through as far as the department's concerned, besides what the committee would do or the municipality would do? What specifically does the department do to ensure that, as the best you can, of course, that there won't be an adverse effect to the water?
Well, as I mentioned, we work through this source water protection committee. Then our department would be involved itself through our own approval processes, and I may let my colleague talk about that process.
Mr. Daphne-Muse? Yeah.
So the first thing we would look at is if that facility was currently under approval. And if they did not currently have an approval to do that mining operation, they would be required to get another approval. For me, we move forward from that point. If they do have a current approval, that approval can be reviewed based on the current standards that are being used now.
So basically what you would do is you'd look at what was there in the past, how old it is, of course, the approval, and if it does meet the current standards today. And if it was passed previously, is there a deadline on those approvals, like for so long it can operate the mine, or after it shuts down before you have to go apply for them again?
For Nova Scotia Environment, typically the length of our approvals are for 10 years.
Yeah, so that would that'd give you considerable protection, especially if the thing hadn't been active for that time. And even if it was, do you have to go to reapproval after the 10 years?
Yes.
And if it did reapproval on it, would it be the new standards they would have to go to, or the standards they originally got the approval?
It would be the
on?
new standards.
New standards. Again, when I'm talking about arsenic and arsenic, again, I mentioned that earlier, in the Montague area, the Montague Mines area, of course, there's some old mines there all over the place. And a lot of the homes have arsenic in their well. And of course, you know what kind of problems that creates. Is there any monitoring of that situation in that particular area to see if it's getting worse or better? Or?
Ms. Snook?
Sorry. I can't speak to that particular area, although David may want to say something after I do. But Nova Scotia has a problem with arsenic in their water pretty much everywhere in the province because it's naturally occurring. And then specific areas sometimes that have been impacted by other activities. And the department does try and monitor them depending on complaints or what the water's being used for in those areas. But maybe, David, you'd like to add something to that, would you?
Mr. Briggins?
Because it is a naturally occurring problem, there's not a lot that we can do to actually change that. So we don't have specific programs that go in and look at a specific area. We tend to focus our efforts more on education and awareness and making sure people have properly constructed wells and that they're aware of the locations in the province where there may be a higher risk of encountering arsenic in their well. And then we have brochures and fact sheets on what people can do if they do have arsenic. And in fact, in your package that you received, there was an example of one of those types of brochures. So, but we don't go around testing wells in various parts of the province because it's a naturally occurring contaminant, and there's not a whole lot we can do about it. And it doesn't tend to go up or down. If it's there, it's there.
And do you have any input in areas like this? Because it is a serious health risk, of course, as everyone knows. In areas like the Montague Mines area, there's not a lot of houses there, and probably the reason there's not a lot of houses there is because of the arsenic, and there's no city water supply. Is there any input that the Department of Environment would have on, I know the municipality does the water projects, any impact or input that the municipality would have, the department would have on that supply of water, clean drinking water? Because there is a requirement in the province for clean drinking water, isn't there?
Mr. Briggins.
Yes, we have a requirement for municipal supplies and other public drinking water supplies that they must meet the Canadian Drinking Water Quality Guidelines. So those are right in our legislation. And of course, arsenic would be a health-based parameter that has a guideline. For private well owners, we don't have a requirement. We often suggest and recommend that they do meet the Canadian Drinking Water Guidelines, but there's no regulation that requires that. So we do, to answer your question, we do work with our municipal supply owners to make sure they're aware of some of the issues and the health concerns with the water. But it's a municipal decision whether they decide to construct a new water supply or extend the services to a certain area. But we're certainly there to help provide information that we may have that would be of assistance to them.
Okay. And I realize it is a problem. The other problem I run into every now and then is somebody's got salt in their well because of the Department of Transportation salting. Usually as a result of the well not being properly constructed, or it's an old well, or too close to the road. In some cases, maybe a little bit too much salt down, but who can say it was or not because of driving conditions. But when a person, does the Department of Transportation approach the Department of Environment if they get a complaint from somebody that says hey, they have salt in their well for doing any testing, or is that the responsibility of the individual?
I can speak to that one because I used to, in my earlier days in the department, my background is in hydrogeology and groundwater, so I used to go out and investigate a lot of these well contamination problems from road salting. And so at that time we worked very closely with the Department of Transportation. Now they have their own environmental staff, and including a hydrogeologist that look into these types of situations. But we provide information to them that we have on wells and water quality in our databases, and we work closely together with the staff from TIR.
What it typically, it's always struck me, and I just really want information on this, if somebody had a proper water test done on their well, and it didn't show, like years ago, and it didn't show a high salt content, and then it did show later, would that help the individual when it comes to dealing with the Department of Transportation to have the problem resolved?
Yes, any background information and water test results are always helpful in any investigation, so you can determine if the problem is getting worse or better over time. And certainly that would be of great assistance to whoever's well has been impacted if they have that information to provide to the Department of Transportation when they're investigating.
Yes, unfortunately, people don't seem to like to test their water. I don't know why, but they don't. I guess maybe, and the cost isn't that prohibitive, really, when you look at how important it is to your health. So just back to the Bridgewater situation, the process is, and it would go to a full consultation in the community through this committee. And then if it was all went through that process, would it then come back to the Department of Environment to review your environmental assessment on it and see if it was okay? Would the Department of Environment do that first if the company made a proper application. How does that work? Is it department works first or the committee works first, or they work hand in hand?
Basically, they go in parallel. So the department still, we have to go through our processes as required in our legislation, but we also at the same time work through the Source Water Protection Committee to address concerns and issues. So they're really going in parallel so that each process can be informed by the other. So it's a parallel process.
In that process, would they do baseline tests on water in the immediate area? Would that be part of the requirement, or would the individuals that own the homes or properties around there have to do those tests prior to the gold mine going ahead, or would the company be responsible for it?
Again, that's usually a requirement for the company, and my colleague can probably address in more detail what we would require as part of the approval process.
Mr. Daphne-Muse, if you'd like to add a little bit to that. Yeah.
It's very site-specific with what would be required in the approval conditions with respect to the gold mine. If the community was concerned and raised enough concerns, and that it identified in the environmental assessment or in the approval process that this was a concern that needed to be addressed, then a site-specific term and condition could be added to the approval that would require monitoring from the company's perspective. It doesn't necessarily that there may be no concerns based on how the process is developed and everything else along the way, but we'd have to wait for those studies before any of the processing would begin to determine what would that site-specific condition look like in the approval itself.
So is there a requirement to test wells, though, in the immediate area before anything starts? You get a baseline to go with, or?
Ms. Snook?
My turn?
Yes.
I was just going to say, in general, any industrial activity, the department can put whatever terms and conditions that they think is appropriate on that approval. So, and normally when a new industrial activity is starting up, we would require that baseline information to be taken during the environmental assessment process to help in the decision making, but most definitely in going forward, so we could keep an eye on what was going on around any site, not just the gold mine in Bridgewater, but anyway.
Yes, well, that's what I thought, but I just want to get that on the record to make sure.
Oh, okay.
To make people
We're happy to put that on the record. We'll be very diligent in monitoring the water supply, especially in Bridgewater.
Yes, that's great. I don't represent Bridgewater, but I think it's a big concern.
I know, but I think it's great that you're concerned about Bridgewater. It's a very nice town.
Thank you. But it is a concern all over, because whatever happens in one place could happen in another. Mm-hmm. And I know there was concerns about Murkyville a while ago, and is there ongoing assessment going on with Murkyville and I forget the material that they're using there to get the gold out of the rock? It's quite a hazardous material they're using. Is continuous monitoring going on there? Did that mine ever go ahead? What's the status on that?
You know what? I have to tell you, I don't know where Murkyville is. So I'm not familiar with that, but
okay.
I'd be happy to look into it, and we can get the information to you however is convenient.
Yeah, that'd be, you give that back to the committee.
Yeah, we'll make a note. It can come back to the committee.
Thank
you. And we'll keep a list of the things that are asked for today.
Yeah, it could be called the Moose, it's back of Mooseland, so it's, anyway, you'll see it when you do it. It was a big controversy at the time.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I just wondered if that ever went ahead. Also along with the water quality, you put new standards in place. I know that, and I don't disagree with the standards, but a lot of the municipalities are really having trouble getting up to speed on that. And it's costing them a tremendous amount of money. I'm the critic for municipal affairs, and I know I've talked to a lot of mayors, and first thing to talk about beside the assessment cap is the water. And when they talk about the new water standards, it's going to cost the municipalities a substantial amount of money, and some of them just simply don't have it. Is there any programs available through the province or the federal government that they can help them get where they need to be with the standards? And I'm not saying the standards aren't good. I believe they are. But, and they feel the same way. But it's just a dollars and cents problem. And if they do that, that means that a lot of other things don't happen in their communities.
Okay, good. Mr. Briggins.
to answer your question, yes, there is funding available. It's usually through various infrastructure programs that our sister department, Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations, are involved with. But just on your question, those standards were part of our drinking water strategy that we came up with in 2002, which was the forerunner to our comprehensive water strategy that we just released now. And that was one of the key parts of that drinking water strategy, was to introduce these new standards and get all our municipal supplies up to those standards. And they're consistent with other standards across the country. They're not any different than any place else. But we've been very pleased with the progress that municipalities have made over the last 9 years. And I know we've already, because I checked this with our colleagues at Service Nova Scotia, we've given over $100 million within the last 10 years for upgrades to municipal water supplies. And we're looking forward to having all those municipal supplies up to our current standards, and we're very satisfied with the progress that's been made.
Just 30 seconds left.
Just a few seconds?
Yeah, 30.
Okay, that's good. I'll ask Alpha some more later. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And with that, we'll turn to the Conservative Caucus. And Mr. McMaster, you have questions for 20 minutes.
Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. My first question has to do with municipalities, as I understand, are required to complete climate change studies, and that's as a requirement to gain access to federal money for wastewater or infrastructure improvement like water systems, and I think wastewater projects as well. Can you tell us why that's important?
Ms. Snook.
All levels of government are spending a lot of time and resources on analyzing climate change and the effects on Nova Scotians and Canadians in general. And in Nova Scotia, because we're coastal, we have so much coastline, we're certainly susceptible to the effects of climate change. And I know in the department we've worked very closely with the federal government in doing studies of many of the coastal communities in Nova Scotia, because we can expect to see sea level rises, and we have seen in recent storms, and more violent storms seem to be really affecting Nova Scotia as well. And those are just a few of the impacts. And of course that affects municipal infrastructure hugely in terms of bridges, and in our department, sewage treatment plants and water treatment plants, which would be in danger of flooding. So there's many impacts for us to plan for and try and deploy our resources in a way to mitigate the effects of climate change. So that's why we're so involved in it.
Are we finding that we have much control over our climate here in Nova Scotia?
Now, today, if we had any control, we would ban rain for 15 days. But no, I don't think we have much control over climate change itself, but we certainly, it's up to Nova Scotians to manage the effects and to plan for those, I think, and we hopefully will have control of that. Where new things go, we're always advising municipalities to look at their zoning regulations and make sure that you're building in an area that won't be susceptible to flooding and the effects of climate change.
Well, that makes sense. And so I guess some of the purpose of these climate change studies is to look at just that, how a municipality would deal with the changes, the impacts of climate change on their, say, their water systems.
Yes. Water and wastewater are primarily concerned with in Department of Environment, but there are many areas that we're concerned with throughout government.
Thank you. Is there any ways that your office can assist municipalities when they're completing those climate change studies? Could you act as a resource, say, or as
Absolutely. We have a climate change group in the Department of Environment that are very knowledgeable about what the current thinking is around climate change, and that's evolving all the time as we get more scientific information about what's going to happen. And they work very closely with both the municipal level and the federal levels of government, and in fact with community groups they're often working with various NGOs in town, and many different stakeholders have an interest in climate change, and we try and make resources available to all.
That's great. So it's so some of the. Could you give us a couple of examples? And maybe you just did there, but can you give us like a couple of specific examples of how you could help a municipality?
The climate change group does studies in general about the whole province, and they've done adaptation studies in many municipalities, and one comes to mind that they did on the south shore of Nova Scotia, just regarding emergency access, what would happen with a significant flooding from a storm on the coast, and just what the various emergency routes would be. And in fact, it turned out that they would have a little bit of trouble maybe accessing a hospital. So they looked at it, alternate routes and alternate ways of access, which are very are impacts that affect everyday life. And those are the ones we're really trying to be helpful to municipalities with.
Okay, thank you. My next question, I know after what happened in Walkerton, governments became very concerned about their responsibility protecting water for people. How do we balance, and I understand now with there's new rules in place, it costs more for municipalities to put together water systems. How do we balance the affordability of water systems, because we need to have them, with the more stringent rules that we see now for water safety?
That process has been going on the past 10 years that Mr. Briggins alluded to, post-Walkerton really, but Nova Scotia was preparing to do a huge look at their drinking water situation before Walkerton happened, and they've been able to implement that the past 10 years, and we're in a very a place that we're very satisfied. We're doing as much as we can to ensure safe drinking water for all Nova Scotians. And you might want to add something to that, do you? Okay.
Mr. Briggins.
So, yes, we recognize that there is a significant challenge there, but we also, and just about everyone that we've talked to agrees that when it comes to drinking water, that's an area that you don't want to, mess around with, because it is so important for public health protection. So we recognize that the challenge is there, and we try to balance that off with the public health concerns and protection. This escapes me here. I was going to make another point. Anyways, I can get back to that.
Sure. And I guess the reason I raise that is the more expensive water systems are, the fewer we can implement for Nova Scotians. And sometimes a water system that's put in place may be better than what they have on their own. So can you give any comment on that?
Yes, the other point I was going to make was the fact that our water rates in Nova Scotia, the rates that municipalities charge to their customers, hadn't really changed very much for many years. We had some municipalities where the rates hadn't changed for 20 or 30 years. So in a way, there was some catching up to do, and that's why you've seen a number of communities have increased their water rates to pay for these changes, because they recognize that there is a cost to making these changes, but that it's a worthwhile investment. So they're able to put a priority on that. And we certainly work with them to accomplish that.
Thank you. And I respect the next question here is may be to do with other people in the Department of Environment, but any comment that you could offer would be appreciated. I often hear of runoff from improperly designed sewer systems, and these could be designed by individual property owners. The way they're set up, they're not set up properly. They contaminates other people's properties. It also could, I suppose, contaminate waterways that lead out into the ocean. And my first question is, what kind of enforcement is in place to protect water? Because I'm sure it's part of your strategy is to try to protect against that kind of activity.
Ms. Snook?
Wastewater effluent has been a concern in the department for many years, and I think you'll find we're doing much better in that regard. And we still have work to do, which is part of the water strategy. But I hope you're not hearing about it as much, because there have been a tremendous effort in enforcement and in standards. We're participating with the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment on new wastewater effluent standards. So at a provincial, federal level, that's really a priority. Maybe Dave wants to add a comment about what we're doing
Mr. Briggins.
specifically.
Mr. Briggins.
Yes, so basically the process that we went through a few years ago with drinking water supplies, we're going through a similar process with our wastewater supplies, and through this municipal wastewater effluent strategy that the deputy mentioned, we're looking at getting all municipal wastewater treatment plants up to current standards, which of course brings the same fiscal challenges that the drinking water supplies did. But we're working with with the federal government and with other departments of the provincial government and with the municipalities to address that issue. So I don't, does that answer your question?
It does help a little bit, and maybe just to put a finer point on it, if somebody, if a landowner was experiencing runoff from someone else's property, contaminating their property, what should really happen in a case like that to assist the landowner who is who's being encroached upon?
Mr. Daphne.
Right away, that homeowner should be calling our local district office. Our inspectors would take that very seriously, go out and inspect the system. If it is a malfunctioning system, there are enforcement options and there are compliance options that can be moved forward. That is at the discretion of the inspector based on the circumstances that are seen in the inspection.
Thank you. And if there was any recourse needed to go beyond that, could somebody contact your office?
My personal office, certainly.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I guess my next question is, what impact do you see upon nature, on wildlife, of say improper water systems? Because that's affecting our, could be affecting sectors of the economy that depend on a good, I think of the fishing sector. If you have runoff from sewer systems that's getting out into the ocean, you could be contaminating the environment for you know, fish biomass and whatnot. Can you offer some comment on that?
Ms. Snow?
It is a priority to keep good, clean water for humans and for animals and wildlife. The department is very concerned with our protected areas, and protected areas are the homes to wildlife. So our water strategy affects the whole province. And certainly in terms of keeping our watersheds healthy and providing a safe environment for all Nova Scotians is a priority. You mentioned fishing in particular. Nova Scotia has had in the past a history of using our ocean poorly for dumping things we shouldn't be. But I think we've made great progress in alleviating that problem. And certainly the Halifax wastewater plant that we have now in place is a tremendous move forward for us in terms of not putting wastewater right into the ocean, and has improved the water quality in the harbour and the Arm. And the water strategy does have that as one of its goals, to continue on to protect our coastal areas, and we work very closely on the developing coastal strategy in that regard to put in more actions that will protect that water.
I think that's very positive. Thank you. My next question. You'd be familiar with, I know most Nova Scotians, when they use water every day, and this is something I used to think about years ago, why should people be concerned about the volume of water they use at home? And I guess I'm referring now to what becomes gray water. So throughout whether you're doing the wash at home or what have you, you're using water. What happens to that water? Why is it important to try to conserve that water and the amount that's being used each day?
I think that it's great when individuals can contribute to the study and to Nova Scotia's water quality by monitoring their use very carefully at home. And Canada has the second highest water use per person globally, which isn't a great statistic to have. It's about 328 litres per day for each person. And the department does a lot in terms of education and with school children, talking to them about ways to conserve water, because it is a very important resource. It's not unlimited. And wastewater that you use to shower or do the wash or run the dishwasher all goes into the wastewater catchment and then runs through the wastewater treatment plant, of course, and adds to the to the wastewater that we're collecting and having to treat. So it's very important to conserve and not to waste the resource, and also to be careful with what you're putting down the wastewater. You know, people are concerned about added chemicals that end up at the end. Well, they mostly come from shampoo and personal care products and things that we use, dishwasher soap at home all the time. So, you know, if you can be conserving and using the minimum of those, it benefits all Nova Scotians.
Interesting point, because there was a story recently about bacon fat collecting in pipes, and was caused a backlog. I think it was in Bedford. So I think, and I think this is something I used to think before I learned more about it, but I think people think that when water is used, it goes into the ground, and then eventually it may evaporate back up into the atmosphere, and it's renewed. But is there, say, a percentage that might be renewed from that process, but is there also a percentage of water that's kind of contaminated forever, or that it ends up just sitting in the ground forever, that it can't become renewed as part of the natural process?
I know what you're referring to, the water cycle that we all did in grade 5 science, where
That's why it's so unfamiliar to me now.
It comes up and rains down, and weren't the teachers wonderful, because we all remember that. But I think that the way we treat water today, it doesn't really run through the ground, to your point. You know, we're running it through the wastewater treatment plant, and some of it, that which attains a certain standard and is relatively clean, is put back into the ocean or into the ground, as you say. And the only thing that's that we are gathering more and more of would be those chemicals or biosolids that we're having to collect and deal with on land or somewhere else.
Right, thank you. And what about for people who have their own, say, water systems and septic systems and on their own property? I guess the same is true.
Yes, pretty much, but your grey water is going out of your septic bed into the ground, I guess, and it's not really returned to the environment directly, but it's the environment cleans it up to a certain extent and returns it.
Thank you. Madam Chair, how much time do I have left?
You have 5 minutes.
Okay. Here's a subject that's been hot in my area, and it's hydraulic fracturing, and there's people concerned about it. Is your office familiar with that, with hydraulic fracturing?
Yes, we are. We're the Department of Environment and the Department of Energy are jointly doing a review of fracturing, what's going on in North America and how it might impact Nova Scotia in the future. We are doing an internal review with technical staff from my department and from the Department of Energy, and soliciting outside advice where needed. And we're very fortunate in that many jurisdictions in North America are conducting similar reviews currently, notably the Environmental Protection Agency of the United States, the Alberta government. I read one the other day from the Association of Petroleum Producers in Canada. Various jurisdictions throughout the United States. It's a concern everywhere with the advent of shale gas. So we are currently looking at that very closely.
Have you any concerns about the water table? Because some people are afraid that if something should happen with the process, that it could contaminate the water table, and then everybody's drinking water would be impacted. Have you any thoughts on that?
Certainly the focus of the review are concerns around water and the impacts of fracturing on water. Specifically, because there have been reports in the media about the effects of fracturing, that it might contaminate groundwater. We're currently in the very early stages of our review, and we're going to keep on top of that.
Have you any thoughts going into the review on it, though?
Well, it appears that some areas certainly are having difficulties with water. But on the other hand, the industry, if it's well regulated and does things properly in terms of their drilling practices and those things, they seem to think that they can, on the other hand, manage those impacts. So we're just investigating all the science and all the reports at this stage, and I'm sure they'll have an interesting conclusion for us.
I've seen reports. I know there's a film that shows people lighting their water on fire, and have you any thoughts of that? Is that something that can be naturally occurring, or is that something that
I think both ways, probably. Scientists tell us that that could be caused by a problem with that person's well accessing hydrocarbon somehow and coming up through the well to the tap. And it can also occur naturally in areas that are gas prone. If you happen to drill a well in an area that has shallow gas formation or coal formations, you'll naturally get some methane bleed off into your water, and you could create the same event. But you can't really tell from the film, unfortunately, what the situation really was, and so it just, again, it gets kids interested in science. So I guess it's a good idea to show it on TV, but you can do it relatively easily, but don't do this at home.
Thank you. Thank you. What about the impact on lakes and watercourses? And in the Lake Ainsley area, that's an area where Petroworth Resources has a license, and they may apply for an application. They haven't applied yet for an application to use hydraulic fracturing, but because it's near a lake, do you have any thoughts on how it might impact the lake?
Any oil and gas activity application would be vetted by the Department of Energy and the Department of Environment, and certainly any impacts on surface water, which would be the lake, or groundwater, which would be local well supply, would be evaluated before any approvals were given. Okay.
And I know from looking at the documents for the application for the permit for conventional oil well, that there were measures in place to protect against surface runoff and things like that. Does your office work closely, I guess, with the people that enforce those standards for those types of projects?
Yes, our Environmental Monitoring and Compliance Division would be very concerned about any release of any fluids from any industrial site, and would make sure that there weren't any.
Sure. One of my concerns, I'll just slip a quick one in here. One of my concerns about fracking in Nova Scotia is that we don't have a lot of experience with it here. What kinds of resources can you draw upon? Because if we don't have a lot of experience, there may be more chance of something going wrong.
We don't have a lot of experience with the activity being conducted within our province, but when people do any kind of activity of that sort, we would check their credentials and make sure that they were well experienced in whatever activity they were conducting. And I think that applies to oil and gas drilling. And typically when we've had people drilling wells in Nova Scotia, they haven't been Nova Scotia companies per se, they've been oil and gas companies from elsewhere in the country or in the world. So.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and your time has elapsed, so I would turn it over to Mr. McKinnon for the NDP Caucus.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure to have the department here with us this morning. I was fascinated with the comments, Deputy, in relationship to your opening remarks with the C.D. Howe Institute. Actually, Stephen Rudy giving credit to Nova Scotia in relationship to the improvements that have been made with safe drinking water. Now, why I was sort of taken aback by that is that the C.D. Howe Institute is not very favorable to governments generally in comments, particularly NDP governments. So I'm wondering if you could just elaborate just a bit in relationship to that.
I agree with you that normally the C.D. Howe Institute is not complimentary about government actions, but I think that, and I can't take any credit for this, but the past 10 years, Nova Scotia has made tremendous strides in terms of bringing our drinking water up to some of the highest standards in Canada. And they also complimented us on the standards that we chose to implement and follow in Nova Scotia. And I must say we have some excellent staff who have been working very diligently over that decade on this particular area. And I think Mr. Rudy was very fair in his assessment of Nova Scotia's accomplishments. And in fact, 4 times in his report did cite areas that he felt strongly we were moving in the right direction and setting a good example for other provinces. And I wouldn't, they weren't high praise, they were very factual praise, which is even better, I think. So anyway.
Thank you very much. I've always been an advocate for spreading government throughout the province and seeing that rural areas are properly served by government. And I understand that you do have inspectors in various locations throughout the province. How many inspectors do you have from a monitoring and compliance perspective? And where would they be located? Do we have a good geographical balance? And I know Pictou County is served by a depot, but could you elaborate on that perhaps?
We have just over 70 inspectors in the Environmental Enforcement and Compliance Division, but the Department of Environment is very well represented throughout the province. I have about 275 employees, and 160 of those are in the field, so the majority of our staff are not in the Halifax office. Our work is really out in Nova Scotia, all over, particularly in rural Nova Scotia, and we're served by 11 field offices that are the home office for all those 160 people. So the Department of Environment is really the face of the government oftentimes in any community, and I think they do a great job, actually.
Well, thank you for that. Perhaps you can be an example to some other departments as well. One of the concerns that I have in my own constituency is that we had a fire at a C&D location, a construction and demolition disposal area in Broadway. And I understand that there are, in fact, cells that keep some of the fluid that, particularly the leachate, but some of the tremendous amount of water was put on the disposal area fire. And I know there are requirements for cells to, and there's a waterway very close to that site in Broadway, and I'm wondering if, in fact, the level or the number of inspections could be increased at C&D sites, because we were very concerned about the waterway that was just behind this C&D disposal site. Could I have your comments?
I'm not really familiar with that site, although I have seen a briefing note about it, because there have been an increased number of inspections at that site after the incident. But I will defer to Mr. Daphne Muse to just tell you a little bit more about what EMC Group does in terms of C&D sites.
Mr. Daphne Muse.
Speaking in general with respect to a C&D site, there would also be some monitoring components. So there'd be some groundwater wells installed to ensure that any leachate that was not being controlled by the cells is being monitored, so that we're not seeing any background concentrations elevating and things like that. So our staff would review those reports when we receive them from the facility owners. If there is any components in there that we would need to look at with respect to, say, maybe we need Department of Natural Resources to help us to review a report, because they have some hydrogeologists as well. So say there's some naturally occurring elements. So I guess that steps back to the strategy about the integrated water management approach. You know, we're going to include the other governmental departments when we need the expertise. But really the monitoring would be in these groundwater wells. We would monitor those, we would inspect the site, and if there is any kind of dramatic changes, such as a fire, definitely our inspections would increase to ensure that there's no release of a substance that would be harmful.
I'd just like to put a word in for the continuance of very regular inspections, not just at that C&D site, but at other C&D sites as well. I'd like to talk for a moment about partnerships. I understand that you have a number of them to bring your 10-year program into being. And one that I have been very aware of is with the Clean Water, Clean Nova Scotia, actually. And a local person who used to be an employee of the Department of Environment, Gord Anderson, was out looking at septic fields and advising people on changes that could in fact take place there. And I think there was an assistance program upgrade some of the bad ones. Is that program going to continue, and how effective have some of your partnerships been?
Ms. Snook.
We do have many great partners, and Clean Nova Scotia would be one that does particularly valuable service to the province in terms of carrying out many detailed projects. I was visiting with them on Friday, and I was so impressed with their staff. You know, they're very keen and very diligent and very able in terms of the impact that they're having in Nova Scotia. The program that you allude to about improving septics, I think is a very important one of the department that's had a tremendous effect and is continuing. And maybe, David, you'd like to speak to it a little more?
Mr. Briggins.
Yes, the program is called the Environmental Home Assessment Program, EHAP, and its focus is on well owners and owners of on-site septic systems that may need some assistance to make some improvements or get water tests done. So that program has been spread out across the province. Clean Nova Scotia is one of our partners to help deliver that program, and we've seen excellent results from it, very high praise, and we certainly would like to see that continue.
I know Mr. Anderson has done great work throughout all of northern Nova Scotia, so I hope the program is funded into the future years as well. We had a great event here yesterday with farmers. The farm community was out for an event here, and the last thing that I would be advocating is harassment in relationship to fertilizers and so on, but there has to be some kind of a balance. I remember being in Ecuador a number of years ago, and the banana plantations were being sprayed, and the runoff was greatly impairing and polluting the shrimp operation, some of them owned by the same large, the banana plant corporate structure was actually part of the shrimp structure. Now, I know we are so far ahead of places like Ecuador, but what are we doing in relationship to monitoring some of the fertilizers that are being used? And our farmers are very, very responsible, and I know that, but there has to be, the balance is a very fine one. Are you finding that balance?
Ms. Snook.
That's an interesting question. The Department of Environment looks at sort of one impact of the fertilizers, and you hit it, the groundwater and the effects on surface water pretty much. But we work very closely with the Department of Agriculture, who really has the frontline contact with the farmers. But oftentimes, I think our inspectors and their inspectors end up at the same site when there is a complaint or something they think is a difficulty, so that they get the picture together and are able to make one aware of the other impacts. You know, it's a question of competing uses in some instances, but we certainly advocate and do a lot of education around responsible use of any chemicals, and fertilizer is a chemical that's usually used to enhance crops. But you know, I just would like to stress that we do work very closely with the Department of Agriculture, and they have currently a program on to about environmental farming with their clients, and I think that has been very useful in terms of making them aware of runoff issues and other impacts that farming has.
And I believe that our farming community is very knowledgeable and is very responsible as well, and anything your department can do to work with the Department of Agriculture to help our farming community would be greatly appreciated. I'm going to be sharing my time, and I think I have just about used half of it, but one last shot if I could. The United Church of Canada has been lobbying for diminished use of bottled water and bought water and so on, so that emphasis won't be taken away from tap water throughout our nation. And I'm wondering if the department is doing anything in relationship to that as well, because so many people today are buying jugs and bottles, and you see them everywhere. There has to be some promotion of the safety of tap water. Any quick comments before I turn it over?
The department does everything it can to promote the use of tap water, and we're so lucky in Nova Scotia to have some of the highest quality tap water anywhere in the world, oftentimes higher quality than what you get in a bottle, I understand. So we do encourage that, and as you know, we don't use bottled water in the government anywhere, both to decrease the amount of plastic going to our landfill and also to promote the use of tap water. So we do what we can.
And I'll turn the remaining time over to Mr. Wynot.
Thank you. Mr. Wynot, your turn.
Thank you very much, and I'll get right into it because of my honorable colleague. Anyways, I want to talk about two issues, and in particular, the reason why is because these two particular issues are, concerning for some of the people that I represent. And one is in regards to private drinking water for what used to be called mobile home parks, but now called land lease communities. They, in particular for Springfield Estates, I have a few questions. Can you just explain how a private drinking water system might be put onto a boil order?
Ms. Snook.
We do monitor land lease communities now, and I think we have about 40 that we work with quite closely, and their drinking water is privately owned by whoever owns the land lease community, and it's up to them to maintain the quality, but any sampling done comes as well to the department, and that's how we are aware of any problems, and would immediately upon being aware of that would contact them to issue a boil water order.
So is it the department that issues them, or can a private owner put themselves on a boil order?
I'm just going to defer to David so I don't mislead you at all. I
Sure.
think I know, but I don't want to make an error.
Mr. Briggins.
Yes, the owner themselves can actually initiate the boil advisory, and often they do because they're the closest to the situation, and they're usually as a precautionary measure, and it's better to be safe than sorry, so we're okay with that. In the event that the owner doesn't initiate the boil advisory, we can do that on the advice of the chief or of the local medical officer of health, and occasionally that is done as well, but it can work either way.
Okay, and how do they come off of a boil order? Is it only the Department of Environment that can take someone off of a boil order?
Right. The owner can initiate the boil advisory, but only the Department of Environment or the medical officer of health can remove the boil advisory. So in that case, we would be monitoring, making sure that corrective action was being taken and satisfied that the situation has been resolved before we would remove the advisory.
Okay, and what sort of measures can the Department of Environment put in place to ensure that the owner of the water source goes with the regulations, or the regulations are enforced? What sort of things can you do as a department to ensure safe, clean drinking water for residents?
So they're required to have a corrective action plan that's right in our regulations. So we monitor that corrective action is being taken, and that can range from increased sampling to remove, if there's a source of contamination, removing the source of contamination. If it's a treatment issue, may require an upgrade or a change to the treatment system. Whatever the action is that's required to address the situation has to be taken, and completed to our satisfaction.
Okay. I guess the reason why I ask these questions is because of a particular project that has been going on in my area. As I'm sure you're aware, Sackville is there's a lot of silt, a lot of red dirt in when land is being disrupted, it oftentimes gets into waterways. And through your department in your local office in Bedford, it was through working with Department of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal and your department, they have found that there was no evidence that the issue that is faced to the tenants there had nothing to do with the Margesson Drive project. And I'm just wondering if you can confirm that.
I'll ask my colleague to speak to that.
Mr. Daphne Muse.
We can get back to you on that, just to make sure. We want to make sure we get that right for you. So
okay.
We'll get back to you on that. Okay,
perfect. And my understanding is, just so you know, the local folks have said, look, there's no evidence of that. And the reason why they say that is oftentimes, if there's a water source or that is being used for drinking water, the folks there explained to me that oftentimes there's when there's a big rain, which we know happened in November, December of last year, that lakes flip. And I didn't realize that that's what happens, but sometimes, as they explained it to me, that in fact the bottom of the lake actually comes to the top, and the top goes to the bottom. And can you explain that a little bit, or I don't know if anybody here is an expert on that, or no? Mr.
Briggins, maybe.
My background is in groundwater,
okay.
But I do know that it's a seasonal process for surface water bodies, that they have this natural overturning or mixing of the lake. It depends, I think, on different factors,
right.
Temperature, rainfall, and time of year. But it's all part of a natural process to ensure that the water course or the water body is is kept in a healthy condition.
Okay, thank you. Second question, second issue is around in the water strategy. Does it discuss anything about siltation?
Ms. Snook, or is it Mr.
And trying to
about which
about siltation around getting into our lakes and our rivers and disturbing the habitat that lives in there.
Yes, the water strategy does talk about that and identifies stormwater management and sedimentation and erosion as one of the actions, and certainly it's something that we consider to be important and something we want to address through the strategy.
Okay, so will that, again, I assume that's the work has begun on that piece of the puzzle?
Yes, part of the piece of the puzzle is just getting some good understanding and basic information about our watersheds and our water supplies. So we're currently doing some of that assessment work right now. In fact, we've partnered with Dalhousie University. Their hydrologic research group are doing a risk and vulnerability assessment of all 46 of our primary watersheds, and starting to collect some of that basic information, and that will in turn guide us in terms of any program or policy changes that we need to make.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. The time has elapsed there with that, so I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Caldwell for the Liberal Caucus.
How much time do we have?
I would say we have 12 minutes.
Thank you.
I'm going to recalculate, though I might give you more. I'll let everyone know.
Okay. Again, thank you. Just a couple of questions. Again, always nice questions to ask. Is there an actual some other way that you watch and see how much our underground water, our water resource is in Nova Scotia? Is it depleting? Is there a way to measure that? Do you track that? Because we have a lot of water being extracted and shipped away in bottled water. How do you know for sure that that's not dropping our water table and causing all kinds of problems?
I'll let David speak to the map because we have many various layers of geographic information now regarding water resources and where wells are and where withdrawals are. But I just make a comment, the department also does issue water withdrawal permits, but the bottled water industry is not a significant withdrawal in terms of compared to what we would take out as HRM or what any other town would take out. It's a relatively small amount, but David, you might want to talk to the mapping.
Yeah, Mr. Brigham.
So we have a network of wells across the province. It's called an observation well network that we monitor on a routine basis. We actually have downhole data loggers that measure the water table change. I think every hour it takes a reading, and that that information is all fed into a central computer system, so we can actually from a computer in Halifax see what's happening with the water table at any of those. I think there's about 40 observation wells around the province, and that information is all available on our website. There are quarterly and annual reports that are done, and people have access to that. So we use those to track changes or trends, any drops in the water table. But as the deputy mentioned, we don't see bottled water having a big impact on groundwater table because of the amount of water that's extracted is actually not that great compared to others. But if it were, we do have a database of all our water withdrawal users and approvals and how much they're withdrawing. We make sure that they're within their allowed limits. And as a further safety check, we actually have separate legislation that deals with bulk export of water so that our water is not removed in bulk quantities and therefore dropping our water table or lowering the amount of water in our surface water body. So I think there's different measures that we have in place to watch for those types of trends.
In your monitoring wells, has there been any change in the water level in the province, either up or down, over the last 10 years?
It tends to, it does go up and down, both within the year and from year to year, but overall it's remained quite steady when you look at the trend over the years. In fact, we've been monitoring since 1965, so some of our observation wells predate our department, and we don't see any consistent trend either up or down. So it's staying pretty much constant.
Now, there was I can't remember the exact street. I should remember because enough phone calls on it. But in Halifax area here, there's one neighborhood that ran out of water. They drilled the wells really deep and the water table was depleted. Is there any monitoring for that? Now, that's just one small area, but how do you monitor that, and what's the penalties for that if someone extracts too much water out of it, or it's not set up properly to start with, or what causes that to happen? I mean, it seems unusual. It's a small water table in that area, and they depleted it, and it just doesn't want to come back.
I'm not exactly
Ms.
sure
Snook?
what area you're...
Ms. Snook, yeah.
Right. I'm not sure what area you're speaking of in particular, but generally, the water table doesn't disappear in an area, but you could be in an area that doesn't have sufficient water to support the number of houses that might be there. I think HRM and our department have worked recently to try and make sure that when developers are developing in an area that they've done the proper water testing to make sure they're an adequate supply for whatever it is they're proposing. And I think that will shortly be part of the the bylaws to prevent what you're describing. As I say, water doesn't normally disappear really in an area in particular, but all areas don't have a great groundwater supply. I mean, I'm sure you've all heard stories about wells that don't have adequate flow. So I'm not sure if that's helpful to what you're describing, but it is a concern certainly in the department that there's good water before the house is built or the apartment or whatever it is you're putting in. Do you want to add to that, David? Because this is really your bailiwick.
Mr. Briggins.
It is an issue in some cases, as the deputy mentioned. It's not so much that the water table disappears, but depending on the bedrock geology and where the fractures are, sometimes it's not always there in the amount needed to supply a number of households in a smaller area. So we've been working with HRM in particular on this issue to develop some guidelines for the hydrogeologic assessment to be done when development is occurring, so that we don't run into this problem. But there's no set limit that people can pump when it's a private well. They don't tend to use a lot of water. But there's no approval issue that would have a limit attached to it. So that's why we have to look at working with HRM and other partners on these assessments that kind of look at the full picture instead of looking at each individual well.
Okay. I know in Digby there was an application a while ago to export large quantities of water that almost went through. How would you monitor a situation like that to ensure that the water table wasn't dropped? Because, and if the water table did drop because of an activity like that, does it recover if the activity stopped?
Well, all what we call large water withdrawals, which would be anything over 23,000 liters per day, requires an approval from our department. And with those approvals, in almost every case is a term or condition that they have to monitor how much water that they're being used and notify us if there's any change, and we get that information, so we would be able to see if there's an over extraction taking place or the water table is dropping. And then we can address that and take and require the approval holder to take the necessary action.
So that would be monitored by the department, or would it be monitored by the person who has the approval?
The monitoring is done by the approval holder, but the information comes to the department and is reviewed by staff in our department.
I've always had an issue with that, because I would rather see the department do the monitoring and have more confidence in the numbers. And even if the proponent had to pay for it, I think that'd be a lot better, because I had some issues years ago with Nova Scotia Power and the horrible crap they were, excuse my language, they were dumping out of their stacks here in Dartmouth. And they did the monitoring and give you the information. So I would have felt a lot more comfortable at that time if the Department of Environment was doing that monitoring. I think that's probably something that maybe the new deputy minister should look at, and we don't want taxpayers to have to pay for that, and that's probably why you do it the way you do it. But it'd be better if the department at least supervised this and made sure that everything was in place, not just getting the data from them and reviewing it, because it would be quite easy to monitor in a different location or whatever the case may be to get numbers that would be favorable, but not really what protecting our residents or our province indeed. So is there any plan of looking at doing something like that? Because I think that's very, very important. I mean, if someone wants to set up a business to extract water or whatever they're going to do, if the Department of Environment would get paid to do it, I mean, just a cost back from proponent would make a lot of sense. I'd have a lot more confidence in the numbers, as would Nova Scotians.
Ms. Snook?
I'll take your advice and check into that. I'm not aware of any changes that are planned. I do know that the department, when they do monitoring, they try and do it on a cost recovery basis with industrial clients. but I understand your issue there.
Yes, I've got a lot of confidence in your staff and sometimes not so much confidence in proponents.
Okay.
Mr. Caldwell, you have 4 minutes left. I've added a couple.
Thank you. I've got a whole pile of questions here. The other thing is I want to talk about a couple of things. The pyritic slate. And when you discover pyritic slate, I realize when you dump it in the salt water, it neutralizes it, and there's been some controversy over that. But in the Clayton Park area, the development's really expensive because of this pyritic slate. And how closely does the department watch that and monitor that? I know it causes all kinds of problems. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it creates an acid which causes all kinds of problems for the watershed area. Could you just give me just a brief summary on how you monitor that and make sure that it's safe when it's uncovered?
It has been a problem throughout Nova Scotia, but especially out around Bayers Lake. We have quite a large deposit of pyritic slate, and it does require enhanced construction methods when they're working. I'm thinking particularly of road building, because when you expose it and rain runs over it, it does make an acid that then runs into the groundwater. As far as the particular way we're enforcing it, I'll have to defer to Jason, but I do know that the Environmental Monitoring and Compliance Division does do inspections for that, and they work very closely with Department of Transportation on it as well.
Mr. Daphne Muse? Mr. Muse?
So our inspectors would be involved in any of the construction processes. We would monitor that. It may not mean that we're on site every day, but we are aware of what's going on, where the rock would be being removed to and being stored or being disposed of. That would be all part of the process of ensuring that that's not causing an adverse effect.
Other thing is, there's been a lot of controversy about the biosolids in the province. And in the past, when I was critic, I did a lot of work on this, and there's some pretty nasty chemicals that come out of biosolids that have been identified. How can we be sure if this material is dumped on the surface of the ground, as it has been in some areas and will be, I would imagine, as time goes on, because I know HRM has a huge problem getting rid of this stuff with the size of system they have here. How sure are we that this is not contaminated in the water table wherever it's being dumped, even if you're using it to, like they did in Point Pleasant Park and the flower beds and things like that, and non-food consumption areas? How confident are you that this is really not going to cause a problem?
We have the strictest guidelines for biosolids currently in North America, and we constantly review any of the new science that's coming out and try to ensure the safety of any biosolids that are produced. Our biggest biosolids producers are in Halifax, as you mentioned, and in Trenton. In fact, our only sources of biosolids, because biosolids are, of course, the treated remains from your wastewater treatment plants. And to become biosolids, then they're treated, that waste is taken from the plant and treated with heat and mixed with sort of an inert ash before it becomes the final product that people refer to, that they spread on land for fertilizer or whatever. And so that's monitored the whole way along. And Class A biosolids are deemed to be safe for and looked at as a resource, actually, by many people, and they can serve a useful purpose. But we are on top of that all the time. We recognize that Nova Scotians are concerned, so we are monitoring what's happening there all the time. And we work closely with the Department of Agriculture in terms of the end use for any biosolids that are produced.
Thank you. I'm afraid your time's elapsed now, Mr. Caldwell, so I'm going to turn it over to Mr. D'Entremont for the Progressive Conservative Caucus.
Thank you very much, and of course
14 minutes, I should say.
14 minutes. Thank you so much for your presentation, and I know we've sort of drifted here, there, and everywhere around water strategy. in our questioning, but you know, a lot of times it's because we have a deputy minister in the House and are able to ask a whole bunch of questions. But I am going to stick a little bit around water issues, and of course water issues that are pertinent to folks in the constituency of Argyll. So maybe there'll be a lot of having to write down and get back to me on some of these things. But I'm going to first start with maybe something more local, and I know the member for Preston did bring this one up. It revolved in around the issue of subdivisions, the experience that we've had with Monarch, Rivendell subdivision, I think down in, well, was that Sackville or up in that area, where they continually run out of water in that area. So I'm just wondering, you know, well, sort of a two-part question. Why does it happen that these subdivisions do run out of water? I have an idea that everybody's drawing on that aquifer and therefore it runs out of water. But if you're constructing a semi-large or large subdivision, what are the requirements for water in those areas, especially since they're using drilled wells?
It certainly is a concern when Nova Scotians don't have access to adequate water. And I did allude before, and I'll ask David if he wants to elaborate on it further, work that we have been doing with the municipality here in Halifax to ensure that the subdivision tests for water delivery rates before the subdivision goes in, because sometimes for geological reasons, there just isn't adequate flow to support a subdivision, and the developer hasn't adequately researched that before selling the lots. But David, do you want to add to that in terms of timing, maybe? When does that come into effect?
Yeah, so that was one example, and there are others around HRM and other parts of the province where sometimes when you get a large cluster of homes in a smaller area, like in a subdivision, there can be competing demands for the water that's there, and that's why we've been working with HRM to develop these hydrological assessment guidelines for subdivisions, so that before the homes are constructed, this information is collected and assessed to ensure that there would be proper supply. The problem in the past has been that each lot, each property was just looked at individually, and when you put them all together in a group, you can have a problem. So that's why we're moving ahead with these guidelines, and I think that will be a big help in the future to avoid those types of situations.
Thank you, and I guess what the added piece is that, you know, as HRM continues to expand and grow, you know, one area that tended to have water and someone shows up next door and puts in another big subdivision, you know, they're drawing maybe on that same area and therefore taking the well around or competing for that water source in that area. Because I know of many people in rural areas that I hear someone builds next door and all of a sudden their well goes to half of the flow that it had before. So I'm just wondering, you know, from an expansion from the size of a subdivision, you know, how does that go to, let's say, a rural area where people are just building, you know, willy-nilly around a certain individual's house or nearby? How could we assure supply to a homeowner in that respect?
Ms. Snook.
I think your point is well taken, and that people do have to not take water for granted. And I think it's sort of a culture change we're going through in terms of, as you get more and more development, you get more and more demands on your water supplies. And the water strategy tries to focus us as Nova Scotians on thinking about those issues, and that, you know, most definitely you do get competing uses in the same aquifer. It's not an unlimited supply. There are limits, and, you know, you have to make sure before you build the house or whatever that there is adequate supply. And the department has made resources available to people through the water portal, specifically with the water strategy, where people can see what the wells are like in the area before they might want to buy the lot or put a well in. But there will be that continuing problem of adequate supply for as much development as needs to go on in rural areas, and people have to think about the water before the development, I would say.
Who is responsible in the end? I'm just trying to, you know, I'm building a new home. I know that in order to have that home, I need to have my field bed system. I know I need to have my well put in. I call a contractor or an excavator, the installer, to come in and do that work for me. Who consults with the water portal, or who's supposed to have the information on these kinds of things? You know, I know the contractor knows how to build a well, or I know that they know how to go and drill a well, but who's doing that extra work and making sure that they're not going to rob water from the next door neighbor?
I think that the water strategy gives us a nice focus to make sure everyone is being educated about these issues. The department does work with the well constructors and the well drillers and various groundwater groups to try and educate those contractors that might be working for individuals about issues around water source. But it basically would still be the private landowner that would have to do a lot of the investigation before they commit it to the development. But this is David's expertise, and exactly. I just want to make sure if he wants to add anything that he feels he can.
Mr. Briggins.
Yeah, so we have, for example, we have available through our website an inventory or a database of all the wells in the province, private wells that have been constructed that people can have access to. And sometimes it might be a little daunting for an individual homeowner to, you know, especially if they don't have a background in water and science. But the information is available. Sometimes people will hire somebody to do that work for them. Certainly in the case of these larger subdivisions that we spoke, they would actually require a qualified person to do those assessments. But there's no service out there that provides these technical assessments to every homeowner that's ready to construct a well. But there is certainly information available to them.
The reason I wonder a little more about it is because there's a lot of effort that's done in, of course, disposal when it comes to wastewater management and that for your home, where you have the level 1, level 2 contractor. They have to go through training. They have to go through X amount. And I'm not here advocating that we need to train people building wells, but you know, why is there so much regulation around the waste, and ultimately we're running into the problems on the potable water side of things? You know, shouldn't there be maybe a little more of balance of regulations between those? I guess you would call them two businesses, but normally it's the same guy that may do both, to make sure that they don't compete for things. Because I think finding water is getting more and more difficult. I just go by my neighbor just the other day, last summer, they run out of water. They were sharing a well with a neighbor. They did want to get onto their own supply, and they dug 2 holes and couldn't find water, so they're still stuck with the neighbor. So I'm just wondering, why does it seem it's still up to the homeowner, and there's no real regulation to make sure that the guys that are building this somehow have a level of certainty on the quality of the water that you're going to get, or the quantity of water you're going to get.
Ms. Snook?
I share your concern, and I think that comes through with the water strategy, and that people can't take water for granted. It really is a wonderful resource, and Nova Scotians are very lucky that we do have very high quality water, but we don't have an unlimited supply everywhere. And I think that the department is doing what it can to educate Nova Scotians and contractors and developers and anyone that will work with us in terms of don't take your water for granted. Make sure you investigate thoroughly before you commit to a new area. And I think our climate change folks would be very concerned about the concerns you mentioned in terms of urban sprawl and all those sort of things. You could get into a number of different areas in terms of water management issues that are going to be facing Nova Scotia over the coming years. And we hope that the water strategy gives us a good foundation to analyze those and be helpful to Nova Scotians in dealing with them.
All right, my next part is going to go around what happens when you go off and build your dream home in a beautiful site. And I've got a couple of constituents that have done this, retired off and went and built this gorgeous home on Roberts Island. Moved into the home and realized after some time that they were getting sick. And they're realizing that it was their water. They feel it's their water. Unfortunately, what happens is that when environment comes and tests the water, the tests, of course, come back inconclusive. There's really nothing there, maybe a little high on aluminum or something silly like that. But ultimately, they can't drink the water. And there's really no recourse for them. They went and built their own house. They hired a guy to go drill a well, or I think it was dug a well. And they're stuck today with a home that they really can't live in because they can't use the water. They can't sell the house because no one's going to want to buy it because of the water. And we didn't have a guideline to put in place to protect a homeowner in that respect. So I'm just wondering, what kind of help could I offer Dave and Monica to get them over this hump, because they've sort of run into every possible wall they possibly could run into. They're completely at a stalemate and have been there for probably a year now. So I know it's a tough to ask this question, but that because of just having a guideline without any real regulations or requirement for anyone to do anything, they now have a home that they can't do anything with. So where could I point them? Because I sort of ran out of places to point them.
Yeah. What you described sounds like a very difficult situation, and I'm not sure. I'm sure I don't have a quick answer.
No, I didn't figure
I just the only thing I can think of is it's a great learning opportunity for other people. You really and I see this more and more, and it encourages me, where you see new lots in a rural area with the well in place, or a developer that has drilled several wells throughout the neighborhood and tested them and checked on the flow rates. And I think that, it's a bit of buyer beware. Make sure that you've got water before you make a large financial commitment. In terms of the situation they're in, it's very difficult. I don't know if they visited in Bermuda, where they install a cistern on the roof and have water delivered by truckload, or in their case, barge. But it would be very expensive. But a lot of people in other parts of the world, that's an everyday part of life, is buying water. We're just so fortunate where we are. In most places in Nova Scotia, there is an adequate supply, but...
Yeah, well, and again, the frustrating part for them is that, they put the well in and the water looked fine. It had tested fine for the guidelines that we would have for water, but they still go back to there's something wrong with the water. They put in a water filtration system, at a substantial cost to them. I think it was probably in the $10,000 to $12,000 range, and the water basically eats up the water system. So the $10,000 treatment system is now useless because the water ate it up of whatever's in that water. So anyway, what I'll do is I'll probably talk to you after, or just pass that note off to you, that maybe someone could be in contact. But they did hit the wall with environment folks in Yarmouth that they've just brushed it off at this point because they still feel they're not being served by that office. I'm going to move on to
30 seconds.
30 seconds. Geez, I don't know what to ask now. Well, ultimately, it's just going to be, we've got a couple of communities that their water is contaminated because of lack of sewer treatment system. One of them is Wedgeport, the middle of the upper lower Wedgeport areas, that they're going to need to have a system put in. So I'm hoping that you work with Service Nova Scotia in helping them find dollars and ways to put a system in. And that's Municipality of Argyll.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, well done. Thank you very much. And we'll turn it over to Mr. Epstein for the NDP Caucus, and again, 14 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the presentation today. It's been very interesting. It's rained nonstop in our province for at least a week, but nonetheless, I do want to ask you about drought. And I wonder if you could give us the benefit of your views as to how exposed we are in Nova Scotia to drought events. In asking this, I'm mindful of the fact that just a few years ago there was a lot of concern in agricultural areas, prime agricultural areas, particularly the Annapolis Valley, about the quantity of water available for agricultural purposes, and although that passed after a couple of years, nonetheless, it was a real concern at the time, and we're all aware of global climate change and how in many parts of the world the drought effects are hugely serious. But I'm just wondering if you can give us your perspective on what the situation is in Nova Scotia, both as to our recent history and as to the prospects for the future.
Just before this rainy period started, we were experiencing quite dry weather, and both Department of Natural Resources was concerned about forest fire, and we're always concerned with the level in the reservoirs, thinking along the lines of drought. Then, of course, in Nova Scotia, wait 10 minutes and the weather changed, and now the reservoirs are nicely recharged. However, the department does look at flood scenarios and drought scenarios quite routinely as part of our work, and so that we're able to give advice, if need be, to Nova Scotians.
And what's your perspective over the last decade or two? What have we been seeing in terms of shortages of water from time to time?
I am going to defer to David a little bit because he's more familiar with the department. He's been there for a long time. Mr. Briggins.
Yes, so we have to prepare and plan for all situations, and including drought, and that's why we do things like monitor through our observation wells across the province, monitor the water table for changes. That's why we carefully monitor the water that's being used by our approved water withdrawal users, to ensure that they're not extracting more than what they're allowed in their approvals. That's why we are trying to get more information out there about the importance of conserving and protecting our water supplies. Because it's not a good situation to be in when you're in a drought scenario, and you've got a huge demand on a limited supply of water. But we do work with our stakeholders, our water users, and encouraging them to be wise in how they manage and use their water. And we keep an eye open for situations where there may be problems developing. And then we have information available on our website and in other forms that we provide. And then of course we are involved when there are situations. We are involved with the stakeholders directly.
You know, and I don't want to exaggerate this, but certainly there was a period of several years, fairly recently, in which the Annapolis Valley really was concerned about the availability of water, and that is our most productive agricultural land. And I know at the time there was actually some talk about the possibility of even having a piping system to bring water from one part of the province to the valley as a permanent piece of infrastructure. I don't know if the department has any views on whether this would be a useful thing to explore, or but in particular, I'm wondering if there are triggering events or triggering signs that we should be keeping an eye on, and I'm looking for maybe some more specific examples or data about things that we should be concerned about.
Ms. Snook.
I think we'd have to get back to you on that. I'm not familiar with the piping system proposal, and I'm sure there is someone.
It was just an idea that came up in general discussion at the time, and it appeared in the press, I think. But anyway.
Yeah, but I'd be happy to look into that for you and get back to you. In terms of the signs, you know, I would defer to David in terms of we monitor those wells, which are a very good indicator of the water table, and if there's any depletion occurring. And, you know, there's obvious signs of drought that everyone would see, as well as the department, and we would certainly put in whatever measures we could to conserve water at an appropriate time.
Yes. Has the Department of Agriculture expressed concerns to you about this or not?
Not to me yet. I'm too new. We're busy on other issues.
You the department
David.
in this case.
Yes.
Mr. Briggins.
Yes, we've worked with the Department of Agriculture in the past. It's something that we kind of jointly try to prepare for and plan around. I was just going to mention in that particular case of a pipeline proposal or any type of proposal like that would actually require an approval from us for what would be considered a water course alteration. So it's not like somebody can just decide that they're going to move water from one water course to another by constructing a ditch or a pipe. So there are some controls in place.
I think what came up at a very preliminary stage of an idea wouldn't be a private remedy, but a piece of public infrastructure to protect the food supplies there. Anyway, I'll move to another topic, if I may. I want to ask a bit more about wells. Nationally in Canada, only 12% of the population is reliant on wells, but that picture varies a great deal province to province. And in Nova Scotia, I think it's around 42% of the population who are reliant on wells. So this is, obviously a significant portion of the population. And although our municipal water supply systems are excellent. Certainly here in HRM, and I understand the problems with smaller municipalities struggling to upgrade and afford what they need. But certainly here in HRM, where a large proportion of the population lives, the standards are excellent. The infrastructure is very good. But I'm wondering if you could help us understand the difference in the standards that prevail for municipal drinking water systems and wells. And could we start by comparing what it is that is tested for when a private well owner comes to the local Department of Health office with their sample of water from their well system for testing, with the range of what's tested for in a municipal system?
Ms. Snook.
Certainly, you're right that here in Atlantic Canada, we have a high percentage of constituents that are on private wells, and so it takes up a large part of the department's time ensuring that those wells are properly constructed and then encouraging people to get them tested regularly to make sure there aren't any problems. But I will defer to Mr. Briggins just for what they test for.
Mr. Briggins.
So usually the tests that are done for private wells are bacteria tests for coliform bacteria as a minimum. We encourage, and quite often people will get a chemical assessment. It's called a rapid chemical analysis package that through the labs that do the chemistry testing. The test for about 30 different parameters. Costs somewhere in the $100 to $200 range. I think it's not overly expensive, but it gives a good idea of the quality of the water by testing some of these basic parameters that give an indication of if the water is safe to drink or not. With private wells, there's no requirement that they have to test once a year or twice a year or 10 times a year. We recommend as a minimum that they do the bacteria tests every 6 months and once every year or two for chemical. So that's quite different from a municipal supply where they have to test weekly for bacteria and quarterly for some chemicals and annual for others and quite extensive.
Heavy metals
heavy
would
metals.
Also be on the municipal municipal water system list. Yeah. Is there any testing available in Nova Scotia outside of municipal water systems for heavy metals? What would a person have to do if they wanted to test their water their well water for metals?
Yeah, there are chemical testing labs in the province that do metals. It kind of depends now if it's a more exotic or uncommon test. It may have to be done at another lab outside the province, but usually our labs have some sort of a arrangement in place with a sister lab where they can just send these samples out. But most of the standard metals and hydrocarbons and those types of tests can be done here in the province.
I think the basic cost for the bacteria testing for well water is around $25, $35, and as you pointed out, the rapid chemical assessment is $100 to $200, depending on I think where you are. And any idea what the metal testing would cost?
Again, it kind of depends on what you want to test for and how much you want to pay. So there's different packages available through the labs, but I know you can get a fairly extensive, I think it's called the EPA analysis that could be up to $1,000, but that's usually not something that a homeowner would do. That's usually a case of a municipal or industrial type supply.
Yes, it's potentially very expensive, of course, but for some things may be worthwhile. As you pointed out, it's not a legislated requirement for private wells to be tested. My understanding is that some provinces have chosen to make drinking water standards a legislative requirement. Ontario and Alberta, and I think Manitoba, and then there are, I think, a number of provinces, BC and Saskatchewan and Nova Scotia, that have gone with strategies. The last time I looked at this was a couple of years ago. That's where my list comes from. But I'm wondering if you're aware of an update since then. Have other provinces now moved to put in place either strategies or legislative requirements? Are you aware? And just to remind you, the provinces I mentioned were Ontario, Alberta, Manitoba, and BC, Saskatchewan, and Nova Scotia. I'm wondering if you're aware of any of the other provinces that have moved on this. Quebec in particular, I'm wondering about.
I'd have to double check, but I don't think it has changed too much. I'm not sure how old your information is, but in the last couple of years, I think it's about the same. But we can certainly check on that, because we are involved at a national level. We sit on there's a committee on drinking water that meets on a regular basis, and they're actually the group that sets the Canadian drinking water quality standards, and we have a pretty good idea of which provinces are using those as legislated requirements.
As an associated point, I'm wondering if you know how many boil water advisories were issued in Nova Scotia in the most recent year for which there would be data.
Again, I don't have the number right off the top of my head. We can get that, because it's something that we've been tracking since 2002. We have a very extensive database of boil advisories, so we can tell exactly how many are currently in place and how many have been issued over the year, and we can certainly provide that information.
Yes, and I assume you would also know the duration for which they lasted.
Yes.
Is that right? Could you provide that information as well?
We certainly can.
That would be great, and I take it would include location, would it, in some sense?
Yes.
All right, that's good. And even though you don't have the exact data with you at the moment, and I appreciate your offer to get it, that's very helpful. Do you have any observation or recollection about locales, places that might regularly turn up on the boil water advisory list in Nova Scotia?
Mr. Briggins.
Yes, I don't, not right that come to mind. I know sometimes we do get, a facility or an area that may have multiple boil advisories, but that also is tracked and recorded, so we know that information.
My recollection is that it would actually extend occasionally to some municipalities that do actually have municipal water infrastructure. Is that right?
So your time has elapsed, though. Is there an answer to that first? Ms. Snook.
I would just like to add something to that the staff were kind enough to provide me with something about that, and I had asked to review the boil water lists in the last week, and we regulate 1,700 public drinking water supplies, and of these supplies, approximately 50 are under boil water advisory, but I would like to note that none of these are for municipal supplies. which is the answer to your question, I think. They all are for what is called a registered public drinking supply, i.e. a rural restaurant or a motel or a campground. And I did look at where they are, and they, interestingly enough, are kind of distributed throughout the province in odd spots. So, you know, anyway, I'm hoping that's helpful.
So we will get the list from you
Yes,
later. That
yes.
would be fine. And Mr. Epstein, your time has elapsed, but thank you very much. Interesting questions. I'd like to allow a few minutes if you would like, Ms. Snook, just to wrap up, or any final comments for the committee.
I would like to do that. I'd like to thank you for your interest in the Department of Environment and the Province of Nova Scotia's water strategy. I trust we've answered your questions, and where they haven't been answered, we will be sure to follow up in a timely manner. Like all Nova Scotians, we understand that water is essential to our health, our environment, and our economy. We know it is not an unlimited resource and that it needs to be managed carefully. The water strategy, Water for Life, will help ensure this province's water resources are protected, properly used, and kept safe. Through the water strategy, we recognize the need for effective tools and strategies for managing all of our water resources, not just our drinking water. My department, Nova Scotia Environment, is the lead government agency responsible for managing and allocating Nova Scotia's water resources. We have 75 inspectors in our Environmental Monitoring and Compliance Division who oversee water-related approvals issued by Nova Scotia Environment. We also have a dedicated water and wastewater branch with an annual operating budget of over $2 million, which is now aligned with the water strategy goals. With the launch of Water for Life last December, Nova Scotia met its environmental goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act commitment and the commitment of the Canada Council of Ministers of the Environment Strategic Directions for Water. The strategy also supports the Council of the Federation Water Charter. The Water for Life strategy will guide how we manage all of our water resources in ways that will benefit all Nova Scotians. It is a government-wide 10-year plan for today and for the future. The 29 actions contained in the strategy will help us better understand the quality and quantity of our water, help us protect the quality and quantity of our water, and help us engage others in caring for our water. Just 4 months after its launch, several water strategy initiatives are already underway or even complete. We are proud of the water strategy, and we look forward to working with as many of our partners and collaborators, both within and outside of government, as we continue with its implementation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and it's been a very informative morning. I thank you for being here, and we look forward to having you back again with other issues to discuss. For the committee, there really is no business today except to make note that we have received the auditor's business plan for 2011-12. So just to take note of that it's been provided. And we will be following this meeting with a subcommittee on agenda and procedures. So if the representatives would stay back for that. And next week is again a big week for us because it's the Auditor General's report that we'll be receiving. And just take note that we'll begin at 8:30 to 9 o'clock with a chance to review the report prior to the auditor coming in and giving us a more full description in camera. So next week's meeting begins at 8:30. So with that, if I could have a motion to adjourn. Thank you very much. We are adjourned. Thanks.